Good morning and welcome to the first meeting of the Anti-Poverty Task and Finish Group. My name is Councillor Sam Coleman, the Council's spokesperson on young people and child poverty. This meeting has been held remotely and is being live streamed via YouTube, and the recording will be available afterwards on our website. Councillors and officers are reminded to put their mobile phones on silent if they have one near them, leave their cameras on if they're a member of the Task and Finish group, and mute their microphones when not speaking, as this will reduce feedback and background noise and save bandwidth to prevent loss of connection. I will first do a roll call to check all the members who are expected to attend are present. As I say your name, please turn on your microphone and confirm you are connected. So the members of the Task and Finish group, I believe Councillor John Barnes and Councillor Mary Barnes have given their apologies. Councillor Carroll. Okay. Councillor Cook.
Here, present.
Councillor Earl Williams.
Present.
Councillor Gray.
Present.
And Councillor Madeley.
Present.
Fabulous. Other councillors joining us today, I believe we have Councillor Stevens.
Present.
Councillor Cortell.
Present.
Councillor Clark.
Present.
Councillor Bayliss.
Present.
Councillor Timpey.
Present.
And the leader of the council, Councillor Doug Oliver.
Present.
I don't think there are any other members in, but if there are, then please put your name in the chat. Officers joining us today, we have Executive Director Malcolm Johnson.
Present, Chairman.
We have Head of Service for Housing and Community Joe Powell.
Present.
And we have Democratic Services Manager Lisa Cooper.
Present, Chairman.
There are also two technical staff in the meeting to operate the live broadcast and to be on hand if there are any technical difficulties. I believe this is Claire and James. Members of the group will be making decisions today by a named vote. Lisa will call out each member in turn and they will either answer for, against or abstain. Members, please remember to turn your microphone again at this point. Please turn off after voting. Because of the new format, members are encouraged to make their comments succinct and pertinent to ensure the smooth running of the meeting. Those members who wish to speak, please indicate by typing your surname only into the chat facility. The chat is persistent in that it cannot be deleted, and any inappropriate use will be deemed as a potential code of conduct matter. Officers wishing to respond to members' questions, please type in interject, and I'll try and get to you as soon as possible. I will ask members who have asked a question if they wish to come back after receiving a response, so there is no need to type your surname into the chat facility again. It is a requirement that all members will have read the paperwork published on the website. Members are reminded not to press leave meeting. If you need to leave the room, just remember to turn off your camera and microphone. Please be aware that there can be a time delay of around 5 seconds whilst members appear on screen. Each item will be reintroduced as we get to it. I will now hand over to Malcolm Johnson, who will conduct agenda item 1. Malcolm.
Thank you, Chairman. Do I have a nomination for Chairman of the Task and Finish group?
I would like to I would like to nominate Sam.
So I've got a nomination, and I think Councillor Cook.
Yes, I'd like to second that proposal, please.
Okay, so Councillor Coleman is nominated and seconded. Do I have any other nominations? Well, without further ado, I will declare you duly elected as Chairman, Councillor Coleman, so I shall hand back to you.
Thank you very much, everybody. It's quite exciting, and I'm quite excited about this committee as well. I feel there's an opportunity for us to do some real good and make some real sort of change and a lasting legacy in terms of how Rotherham District Council deal with poverty. So we'll now go on to agenda item 2, apologies for absence. Lisa, are there any apologies?
Yes, Chairman, Councillors John and Mary Barnes.
Thank you very much. Okay, agenda item 3, disclosures of interests. Members, please speak clearly if you have a personal and prejudicial interest and say the agenda item it refers to. Members with a personal and prejudicial interest will be asked to temporarily leave the meeting at the start of the item. Lisa will invite members to rejoin the meeting when the item has finished. Anybody got anything they wish to declare? Okay, fabulous. We will now move on to agenda item 4, and I believe Joe Powell is going to introduce the report. Joe.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, everybody. And just to remind everyone, the Overview and Scrutiny Committee all the way back in November 2019 agreed the draft terms of reference for the Anti-Poverty Task and Finish Group, which are appended Appendix A. And just to sort of cover those in a little bit of detail, just to remind everybody of the aims and objectives of those. The objectives are to undertake a review of the accessibility of appropriate financial products, including the analysis of forms of less appropriate forms of credit and the extent of their use, to assess how residents are educated about finances and then consider improvements, to consider the impact of the council tax reduction policy and its accessibility, particularly those in hardship, to consider the impact of council administered discretionary housing benefit payments, DHP, and again their accessibility and impact on those in hardship, to investigate financial advice and homelessness advice, employment and training advice in the local area and more widely, and to investigate the availability of affordable fuel, food and other provisions, and how we can support these. So just to remind everyone, obviously the impact of COVID-19 and indeed the first recommendation on the report is to a revised timetable, which can be found at Appendix A, and which we'll discuss, I assume, Chair, at the end of the report. We'll go through those recommendations perhaps one by one. We've received since a fantastic report from Councillor Coleman in co-produced with colleagues in the Alliance, in the other Alliance, to propose some ways forward and some next steps, and really just sort of giving some process behind the objectives and how we might get to those objectives. And those are Appendix B in more detail. Just to summarise those briefly for members. The report highlights two distinct stages to the process that the Task and Finish group might adopt. The first is a research and evidence gathering stage to collect evidence from residents and outside bodies on levels of poverty in key user groups, especially lower socioeconomic areas, assess restrictions and possibilities surrounding the council tax reduction scheme, and identify best practice and areas for improvement. The report proposes that we take that approach to research and evidence gathering over a number of sessions to be held to establish the impact of poverty and establish how we might move towards our objectives. And I'm sure members will have had some thoughts on how we achieve that, and perhaps this is going to be, again, forms our discussion today. The strategy and action stage within the Rother Alliance report the report recommends that we note that approach and perhaps wait until we have gone through the gathering phase, before the evidence gathering phase, before making any firm decisions on what the approach should be and what recommendations should be. I think within the report, Appendix B, it's clear that there's a desire for a strategy, which is also in the terms of reference, and I think that's something we should certainly work towards, and the report recommends we work towards. But that we note that approach and leave, as I say, the final action plan and approach to after the evidence gathering phase. So, yeah, in conclusion, that the recommendations then are that we revise the timetable, that we adopt the approach Appendix B for research and evidence gathering, and that the strategic objectives and actions are determined at the end when we've done that first stage. So happy to take questions, and I'll hand to you, Sam, to talk us through how we might achieve those objectives. But thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Joe. I think Malcolm wanted something to add there. Malcolm.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. I mean, you've rightly said at the start that there's great opportunities with this group. I mean, Joe summarised the approach, and thanks to those members that put those proposals together. I think very well thought out and laid out approach to issues. Just one point I was going to make, I think, as a sort of setting the scene a little bit as well. I think one of the things we need to be wary of as we go through this is a lot of things that we do are dealing with the symptoms rather than dealing with the causes. And I think it's important that we clearly identify what the causes are and not just deal with those symptoms. There will be bringing a bit of reality perhaps into it at occasions where we will have to identify that all we can do as an organisation is deal with the symptoms, but it's being aware when we're doing that that's the approach we're taking. And I think the approach that's put forward and that Joe summarised and that's in the paper is an ideal approach to actually dealing with that, because the first stage is this research stage where what we're actually looking at is not just what's happening, but what's behind it. So it's just really to set the scene, Chair, for the discussion, if I may.
Yeah, thank you very much, Malcolm. And just to speak briefly on the report, obviously, whilst I created the report with others, I'm very much open and hoping that it will change and adapt with discussion and following the evidence and research gathering, if that's how members wish to proceed. I really think we need to make sure that any decisions we take and any steps we go forward with are evidenced and we think will work and will target both the cause and the effect of poverty. With that being said, did any members have anything they wish to say on this? Any questions for Joe or anyone, or any comments? I don't see any names in. Here we go. Councillor Cortell. Yes, Paul.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of small observations. First of all, I happened to be talking to an active member of Christians Against Poverty yesterday, and they would like to be added to the list of organisations to give evidence on this report. The second point is that I think that one detail that might be missing from your report and could be added is the cost of and access to public transport, which I think impacts on other things.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor. Joe, did you have any comments on those?
None other than that I've made a note about access to public transport. So that's
brilliant. Thank you, Joe. In terms of adding groups to the evidence gathering, obviously there is a danger here that there are so many groups that deal with various aspects of poverty. If we have too many giving evidence, we'll be sitting here for the next 6 years listening to evidence, and whilst that's great, at some point we do need to start taking action. And so if members of the group had a steer as to how they wanted to trim the amount of evidence gathering, if they felt that was necessary, or in what particular areas of poverty we really wanted to gain the most evidence from, then that would be most welcome as well. I believe Councillor Clark has something to say. Charlie?
Thank you, Matt. Yes, thank you, Chairman. One of the issues, I'd like to make actual general comments, because many issues around poverty are out of Robert's control. The benefit system, universal credit, the levels that have been reduced on housing benefit, all have had a tremendous effect on people, but they're not things that Robert personally can address. Another issue is not all council or even the public realise that Robert only receives 12% of our council tax. Having 100% council reduction scheme, you'll find when you look at the evidence gathering, I'm sure chief officers can tell you that, it could cost us 2 staff posts and around £80,000 in lost income, and the county council would lose a much more heavier sum. We do have the council tax hardship scheme, so that people can claim and their individual claims assessed on its merits. Last year, 78 people were helped with this. A large number of retired residents who live alone or on fixed incomes are also receiving support by paying 20% of their council tax, about £30 a month, where Band C full payment is around £160. So it's not just young families who are struggling to make ends meet, it's also elderly single people on fixed incomes. Your committee will have a difficult task when it comes to this, and I'll be interested to know if you've got a budget to move any of your proposals forward. Any recommendation will need the support of other agencies to be really effective. You obviously receive information from food banks, citizen advice, social services, which will be useful in assessing the size of the problem of poverty and robber, which is both rural and urban. It's very sad that many young families are only surviving at the moment with support from family members. I know from my own experience, grandparents are paying bills, buying food and school uniforms for their grandchildren. It's ironic reflection on today's society that retired residents who thought when they retired they'd be supported by their children, and now find the reverse is the case. I fully support Robert trying to address poverty in Robert. It will not be a very easy task. Also useful, most councils know if you go to East Sussex in figures, it gives figures for each ward on issues such as poverty, people on disability, health, percentage of people on benefits. And I'm sure ward councils will want to contribute to the anti-poverty evidence gathering. Really, central government, if it has the will, can address poverty in this country. Increases in the minimum wage are a start, but the issue is very complex and involves many government departments. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you for that very detailed comment there. I think your experience on the council is very, very welcome, and your experience of the council systems and I appreciate your comments. Thank you very much. I believe Malcolm wanted to say something. Malcolm.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. It was just sort of there will no doubt be several comments made by members of what they'd like to see come out of it. I think, if I may suggest, the important bit today is to concentrate on the research and evidence gathering side of it, because that's stage one of the process, and then what we do after that depends on what we find on stage one. You rightly pointed out, Sam, that there are probably an endless number of organisations we could consult, and perhaps one of the things we want to do is who are the most relevant that we want to consult, but not ignore others, but maybe come up with a standard form of questions that we could send to them so that we can take other people's views on board and consider them. And could I make one suggestion on page 4, big page 4, little page 4, big page 10, which is under the research and evidence gathering, which is in the 4th bullet point, which currently says, assess the levels of poverty and deprivation. Could I suggest that members might like to add assess and understand the levels of poverty? Because I think it's not just about sitting there looking at figures and saying, oh, isn't that, well, that's terrible, or isn't that interesting? It's about understanding what's behind that. So if I could suggest the addition of, as part of the way forward, and understand the levels of poverty. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Malcolm. Yeah, and I think that is a really important point. I think we really need to make an effort as a committee to really get to grips with and understand where the poverty is, why it's there, how best to avoid it in future, and how best to help people out of it who are currently in that situation. I believe the next person who wants to speak is Councillor Cook. Vicky.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of comments to make under strategy and action. But one of the things I've done since March, during this lockdown, is I sat in on a webinar about council omni-channels, and it was absolutely fascinating. And I'm very aware that Rother District Council do, to a certain extent, already do this. But I just feel that we need to be concentrating more so that if somebody comes in a distressed state into the council or rings up, we're able to help them completely, rather than, oh, you need to phone this person, you need to phone that person. We need to be able to look at holistically about what their situation is and what help they can be offered. I just wanted to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cook. And I think that's a really important point there. I think maybe during the budget cuts of recent and past years, the sort of more holistic approach had to be thinned down a bit, and maybe we can start to look at trying to become a bit more rounded, I guess, in our support. I know from experience from my residents that some people come to the council with their papers for their benefit money or whatever it is that they need help with, and it can sometimes feel a bit intimidating. Even though our customer service team are lovely, they sort of get handed a wodge of forms to fill in and sort of told thank you very much, and if there was more we could do to help those who are in need, that'd be very much welcome, I think. Councillor Stevens. Jeanette.
Yes, thank you, Sam. The thing I want to bring up about poverty is in Rye, my area, there's a lot of young couples that cannot get housing and are forced into the private sector, and it's putting a terrible strain on the families with their children, and they're breaking up because of money problems, because the private sector is really expensive in the Rye area. We do need to think about housing for the youngsters in Rye and surrounding areas, because it is a real problem. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Stevens, and I agree. I think housing is very much something that we need to consider. Although obviously we do have separate bodies and indeed a cabinet member for housing, and so perhaps one of the roles of this committee could be to feed some steer towards our housing member. Joe, you wanted to interject?
You've just covered it, Sam. It's just to stress that the homelessness and housing strategy is there, and that we should absolutely, that could be, in the context of our findings from this committee, could be refreshed and updated to accommodate anything we find in a housing context in this context, which might be.
Can I come back? There is a terrible poverty with the housing, with paying for private renting. It causes poverty. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jeanette, for those comments. And I think I'm really glad that you're here, Jeanette, actually, because obviously Rye is one of the three areas in Rother which come under the beacon of lower socio-economic areas. I know you've got Sidley, Bexhill Central and Rye, and obviously with Sidley and Central both being in Bexhill, it's really important to also have that experience of poverty from Rye as well. And obviously all wards, there are people in poverty, but thank you very much for coming as well, Councillor Stevens. It's really good to hear from you. Councillor Bayliss.
Oh, sorry. Yes, there's a couple of points. Councillor Clark, when he made his comments, talked about older people contributing to their council tax. But forgive me if I've got this wrong. Aren't people of pensionable age eligible for 100% council tax relief? Isn't that it sort of creates that divide? I mean, one of the people that I've got lined up to provide me with some evidence around poverty is one of those people who is approaching their birthday, where they will start to get 100% council tax relief. And it will make a huge difference to them as an older person. And the point that I will be wanting to make, I suppose, is that that group of people who are just before their pensionable age, who sometimes fall into real struggles. She also applied for the hardship fund, but wasn't successful, and you really have to be on your uppers it seems, to be able to get any assistance from the hardship fund. The second point I just wanted to make was around my area on the cabinet, which is around economic development and the recovery plans, and I'm really hoping that this task and finish group will be able to feed into those recovery plans. The Rother Alliance has some sort of big ambitions around economic development, about creating new jobs, high quality jobs in the district. But we need to remember that we need also to make sure there are a supply of sort of, if you like, jobs which enable people to get off unemployment and onto the ladder of employment. And we mustn't forget that. So this is very timely. And when you are considering your recommendations for the future, maybe those are some of the things that we can pick up in our economic development strategy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bayliss. The point about people of pensionable age receiving 100% reduction, I think that's correct. I think that's a government scheme. But I'm Joe, I don't know if you had any knowledge of that, or Malcolm.
Yeah, Chairman, if I may, yes, the pensioners can do. Our local scheme only applies to working age applicants.
Right. Thank you, Chair. Sorry, thank you, Malcolm.
Thank you, Chair.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to take the next couple of councillors who have put their names down, and then I think it might be helpful if we go through the research side of that appendix and just see if there's any comments on the individual items before sort of taking a vote on whether to proceed with that. And I think today is really about whether we want to launch ourselves into this sort of research and evidence gathering process as Joe's set out in his report. Councillor Stevens, you put your name down again. I don't know if that was before you commented or if you have anything else to say.
No, sorry, I'll put it down twice. Sorry, thank you.
That's okay. Councillor Cortell.
Thank you, Chair. Commenting on Councillor Stevens's point about how expensive private sector housing is, and I totally agree with her on that. Our cabinet member, Councillor Byrne, does have a handle on this. He has asked me to undertake some research on the gap between the local housing allowance and market prices in the private sector, and to examine ways in which that can perhaps be reduced. And I have earmarked this Friday in my diary to start that work, and I will be doing some more next week. I don't promise to have any brilliant results on this, but I will attempt to address it. So I can say that Councillor Byrne is very aware of this and is keen to try and address it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Councillor Cortell. And I agree. I think Councillor Byrne is doing a great job in his portfolio, as Charlie did before him. And hopefully anything that comes out of our research and evidence gathering in relation to housing and homelessness, as mentioned earlier, can be fed into the strategy there and to Councillor Byrne. And obviously Joe's here with his many hats on, as is Malcolm and that. So I think anything that we discover or we learn can be shared across the council in many regards, I think. Councillor Clark, you had something else to say there, Charlie?
Yes, when we talk about evidence gathering, we also need to be aware of how we can help people access information. I said to Ben Hook some weeks ago, I believe it would be useful to have an attachment to the Rother website with useful numbers for people, such as citizens' advice, food banks, charities, social services, so that if people are struggling, and really, we should really be able to, on the Rother website, have a dedicated page, really useful numbers, because we know there are a number of charities that can also help people when they're really struggling. I think that's something that might be useful to us as an organisation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charlie. I think that's right, and I think when we come to looking at what actions we want to take after we've heard evidence and we've done our research and understood the issues, I think looking at the website, looking at accessibility and how we can open ourselves up as a council and let the people who need to know about our services. I think that's going to be a very important part of any strategy we go forward with. Okay, so I've got no other names in the chat. So what I'll do is I'll go through the sections of the research and evidence gathering page of the appendix and just ask for any comments or questions on those. So the first, I think we'll go for the first 3 bullet points on big page 10, which is to do with council tax reduction. So for a bit of context on this, obviously as a council we used to offer up to 100% council tax reduction. That was then changed to a maximum of 80%, I think, due to budget restraints and the squeeze that happened then. So what these 3 bullet points are looking at is to assess how many of those who are currently on the 80% would have qualified for 100% reduction under the previous scheme, whether it's possible to increase the reduction by more than 80% without being outweighed by the collection cost. I understand from talking to Robin Venard that the reason we capped it at 80% was because at like 85%, 86%, etc., we'd end up spending more on collecting the money than we would on the actual money we receive. But it would be interesting to know whether we could say go to 81% rather than 80%, because quite often we hit a round number rather than the actual number, and there might be a little bit of leeway there perhaps. And also assessing whether any of the council tax reduction measures put in place because of COVID-19 could be sustainable going forward. Obviously, there were some temporary measures put in around council tax and reducing people's council tax, and some of those may be able to be applied, even if it's in a smaller way to people in poverty. But I think to get that information would be very useful. It shouldn't be too hard to get that information, I think, as it's all within the council's walls, so to speak. And it might be nice to hear from Robin, or Robin to inform Joe or Malcolm or whoever to give us that information. But I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that, any comments?
Chairman, if I may, sorry, I didn't put my. I mean, I think it's quite right to challenge and to look at things and to ask for information on this. And I think there could be a danger today that we debate the issues rather than debate how we're going to get to the issues, if you like. And I think the important thing is if this is an area members wish to look at, then members are perfectly entitled and should look at it, and should challenge it. And I think you're right to say we have put temporary measures in place. I mean, I would say that anything could be continued with an endless pot of money, but what we need to do is, in one sense, is decide how we spend the available money, and that is a valid and perfectly legitimate way forward. So I think as we go through all these points, I mean, it's just bearing in mind it's not so much what we want to do. Ultimately, it's what information we need to arrive at that final conclusion. So, but I think you are quite right to ask the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. And I think it would be useful for all of us, I think, to know the limits and the extent to which we can, if we wish to, modify the council tax reduction scheme. So as there's no, oh yes, Polly, hiya.
Sorry, Sam, I didn't put myself in the chat. I just wanted to say that, as you probably know, I've recently taken over as the Rother representative for Citizens Advice Bureau. It was previously Paul Cortell, and they have been having meetings with Chris Watchman from the council about how to tackle council tax arrears. And that's certainly something that the Citizens Advice Bureau are very concerned with. Malcolm will know about this as well. So it is something that's being looked at, because a lot of people go to Citizens Advice for help on council tax arrears. So I just want to say it's been looked at independently as well.
Brilliant. And I think the CAB are also currently on the list of organisations to hear from. And I think their voice would be very valuable, actually, because they're kind of on the front line of when people go looking for help. They're the sort of first people they often go to. Okay, have we got any further comments on those 3 bullet points? I don't think so. Okay, so the next section of the report is on key user groups, and this is to assess the levels of poverty and deprivation within the following key user groups, and listed are quite a few key user groups there. At the top we have the BAME community, migrants and asylum seekers. Especially in light of recent events, I think it'd be quite good to find out some evidence and information for these key user groups to make sure that they're not disproportionately affected by poverty, and if they are, how we can change that. And likewise for the other groups mentioned, the LGBTQ plus community, the disabled and neurodiverse, children and young people, the elderly, those in receipt of social care, self-employed, unemployed, and those in precarious employment, universal credit job seekers and housing benefits recipients, and people living in the private rental sector as well. I think those are some really key user groups where, certainly in my experience and in experience of other members, there seems to be a higher occurrence of poverty, and it'd be really useful to find the data on that. And I'm sure a lot of that data may be available on East Sussex in Figures or within the council system. And if it's not, it would be good to see if we can find out that data or begin a process to collect that data if it's absent from our sort of data pool. Does anyone have any comments on that? Yes, Councillor Cook.
Thank you very much. The group that concern me a great deal are, as you stated here, those in precarious employment. A lot of people, particularly during this COVID time, have found themselves in immediate and unexpected poverty and deprivation and need help straight away. They may only need help for 3 months, but if they can get that help immediately, then they don't continue to spiral down and end up becoming the bottom of the heap. It's one thing that Food Bank has done really, really well, in that we immediately help somebody out so that perhaps for a whole week, the money that they might have spent on food, they've been able to sort bills out or provide the children with a pair of shoes, and so then don't fall in to that poverty group. So I think that's also a group that we need to be gathering evidence about, people that find themselves in that temporary situation, that people that we can really help. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Cook, and I think that's a very important comment to make there. Councillor Cortell.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of areas which a little bit of investment might save quite a lot, might be useful. First of all, recent rough sleepers. They have been through a lot of mental trauma, and they very often just need mentoring, need someone whom they can just talk things through with, and that might enable them to move along a more productive path in the future rather than go back to where they were. And another group are victims of domestic violence or abuse. I'm aware of one at the moment who's been housed by Housing Needs, who very, very much needs counselling. And I think that if she had that, it would enable her to get on the right track. And I think these sort of psychological areas is possibly something that we're overlooking.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Cortell. And so in terms of evidence gathering for key user groups, would you be suggesting that we add abuse and domestic violence victims to that list to get some data on, and possibly homeless and rough sleepers as well?
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I think those are important key user groups to get information on as well. And thank you for those comments, Councillor Cortell. Joe, you had a comment to make there.
Yeah, it was just to highlight that to pick up on Paul's comment, really, that poverty, we need to move away from just thinking about poverty as financial poverty. I think maybe that's what Paul's is behind Paul's comments, is that all of those user groups, we need to think about access to, where there's health poverty, where there's poverty of access to employment, poverty of access to financial support. So it's trying to look at poverty as sort of, and in the initial report, actually, it might have been helpful to dust that down actually for this meeting and just highlight what we mean by poverty, what the impacts of poverty are. The previous report to the report that the terms of reference was attached to. So yeah, it's just trying to just feed that in really, that it's a broad spectrum of definition behind what we mean by poverty, and that, you know, that might be something to hold in the middle of the group actually throughout, is what do we mean by poverty, because it can mean very different things to different people.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Joe. And I think that might be quite useful, especially when we're gathering evidence for key user groups and from organisations, is looking at it in the context of the different kinds of poverty and the different sorts of poverty. I think that'd be, again, Councillor Cook sort of mentioned a holistic approach. Again, I think it would be good to have a sort of holistic view of poverty and the different strands and areas of poverty. The other thing Councillor Cortell mentioned there was about monitoring, and that might be something to look at when we get towards the actions stage of our group as well. Okay. Any other comments on the key user groups and getting data from key user groups? I don't think I've got any other comments in the chat window there, so we'll move on. So the next, in terms of the council and what we can look at doing and improving within our own services, so that involves identifying where council departments and cabinet portfolios might do more to alleviate poverty and deprivation. I think we don't want to dwell too much on nitpicking at everything we do as a council, because that might come out in the strategy and later on. But I think it would be good just to perhaps have a look at what we're doing across the council in already in this area and where improvements might be sought. There is also best practice in terms of helping residents, certainly in terms of income poverty, with increasing income and limiting outgoings. So perhaps some sort of financial advice and looking elsewhere to see where it's worked, what's worked in terms of helping residents take control of their situation and their finances a bit. And then in terms of looking at the council's key performance indicators and whether we have the adequate KPIs to assess how we're dealing with poverty and deprivation, or whether we might need to create some more key performance indicators for the council to keep us on track with that. Any comments on those three items? No? Yeah, Joe.
Yeah, only just to underline really that I think, not wanting to preempt the process, but I think in terms of what outside agencies are doing and the effect we as a council can have on health outcomes, the effect we can have on employment outcomes, I think without again wanting to jump the gun, I think it's likely that we're going to find we've got a lot of constraints in how much we can impact those areas, and principally resource constraints. If we want to start interjecting directly or into supporting rough sleepers more readily, for example, or specific groups, it's going to have resource implications. But against that is what we do ourselves, and the process, just simple things we do. The process for accessing the council tax hardship fund, for example, the process behind accessing my own homelessness service. I think there's a great deal we can probably do in regards to what we do and what we have control over. And while I agree, we don't want to turn into a sort of, navel gazing nightmare of, nitpicking and all the rest, we may find that where we can have the most impact is on what we do. And actually, that might be just to acknowledge your comments, absolutely true. But I wouldn't want to lose, in some ways, you might even want to start the process we adopt in terms of evidence gathering. You might want to split, in my mind, with equal weight. How can we support what others are already doing very well, and how can we change what we're doing to make in terms of impact? I think those two things probably need to be thought of in two spheres almost.
No, absolutely. I I think I agree there, Joe. And certainly when it comes to actions as well, making sure that we take as many actions internally as we do, sort of just broadcasting to others what we want them to do. And I think there's probably quite a lot we can do. We all know that without using the word red tape, the amount of hurdles that sometimes local government find when procedures happen, and others from outside can find trying to get into the council's sort of castle walls, and if we can lower a drawbridge in some sort of
indeed,
way,
a lot
that
of
would help.
processes are often designed to make it as easy as possible for the people running the process, not necessarily people accessing the service.
Yes, yeah.
I think that's a fair comment generally, not just of RDC, but across the whole of, well, life perhaps. But yeah.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Cook.
Yes, thank you. I was rather interested in your comment about identify best practice terms in helping residents increase their income. And I'm just wondering, this may be more appropriate to come under strategy, but does Rother District Council have an education department whereby you could actually go into, say, sixth form colleges and actually talk to young people about how to manage budgets, what you're like if you're going to set up your own home, what kind of bills you're likely to encounter, so that this education begins at a much younger age before they get into this kind of downward spiral? I don't know.
Malcolm, did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, no, we don't, because I mean, to be honest, what we do with people with debt counselling or whatever it is, we would refer them through to people like Citizens Advice who deal with that, because it's a very specialised area of work. It's not an area of work that we have staff qualified in, and to be honest, it's an area there are people out there who do it much better than we ever could, and I think it's one of those things that we need to look at. I agree that with the point that Councillor Cook is making, that I think people come out of school, all of a sudden they hopefully get a job, and they're in the big bad world and sort of handed money and don't know quite how to deal with it, how to budget, how to manage. And I think one of the challenges, if I may, Chair, for this group will be, there will be probably hundreds of things that could come out that could potentially be done, and it's going to be about prioritising what are those bits are important, what we can do, and then looking at what pressure or influence we can apply on others to actually, take some action. But at least we've identified what needs to be done. But the short answer to Councillor Cook is no, we don't have people who would do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Malcolm. And I think it will be quite a challenge for us to find our priorities, because at the top of the funnel there is lots of things we could be doing, and then the budget restraints and everything else make a very thin slither of an end funnel. So we have to really, especially with COVID as well, there's a lot of issues there. Deirdre, you've got your hand up. Did you want to say something? You're muted, Deirdre.
Yes,
sorry.
please.
There we go.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry. I just wanted to say that the trouble is, I think, when people are really struggling, they're usually very depressed. And if you're very depressed, it's very hard to take advice about things, because you're not in the right frame of mind. And when I've spoken to some people, when they've mentioned the fact that they can't afford to feed their kids and so on, they just spiraled into this downward kind of state of mind. And really, if they could get themselves out of that bit, then you might be able to help them in as much as that. I think it's a great pity that no longer do schools do domestic science, because when I was young, you did, and you were taught to cook, and you could use ingredients and cook much more cheaply. And now people don't really know how to do that anymore. So they'll perhaps rely. I know my late husband, who had Earl's Bakery in Sidley, and he, if anybody, knew exactly how difficult it was for some people. And he would tell you that mums would sometimes go into the bakery on their way to school with the children and buy them a large sausage roll for their breakfast, which was probably a very expensive way of giving them breakfast. But I'm not sure how you advise people that a packet of cereal is an awful lot cheaper. If you're depressed, you just can't get into the right mindset, and I don't know how you help people get out of that, because depression is a very hard thing to cope with.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Williams. And indeed, I think mental health is a really big factor in this as well in terms of poverty. And when we start to look at sort of how people remain in poverty and get trapped in that, it often gets called the poverty cycle. Mental health is often a key factor in that, because especially if someone has depression or anxiety, whether that's something they already had or whether it's being brought on by their situation, it can sometimes really limit their prospects and how far they're able to go in terms of lifting themselves out of poverty. In terms of education and in terms of cooking and domestic sciences and such, I think actually perhaps it's a bit of a dip, but it's coming up now. I think certainly in my experience as a younger person, I think there's a lot more in terms of food technology classes in schools. There's a lot more accessibility in terms of most kids have some sort of access to YouTube, where there are a lot of sort of cooking videos and tutorials online and stuff. So I think in certain aspects, education is easier to access now, but at the same time, there are also those clear gaps where people could do with the skills to help them sort of be independent and autonomous, and perhaps that's something we could look at, I guess. Sorry, Joe, you had a...
Oh, I'm not sure it's relevant now. It's just on an earlier comment, just to underline that we do fund the Citizens Advice. Yeah. And that we also, there are we do a few discrete projects, modest projects in schools, but they're quite, in a homelessness context, they're nothing to speak of in terms of a full-time role or anything, but we do make efforts to get into schools and reach young people. But this is the sort of thing, again, I'm stepping across what the evidence gathering phase will bring to light, I'm sure. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's sometimes it's very easy to sort of say, oh, we already have an idea of what we should do, and actually I think hopefully there'll be some revelations during the evidence gathering. And you know what, if we listen to the evidence and we start to understand it and we say, well, actually what we were thinking before was correct, brilliant, we can go with that. But I'm hoping certainly that there'll be something that sparks up. Someone will say something and we'll go, oh, we can do that. That would make a real difference, which is why I think this is really important. So have we got any... Councillor Madeley, sorry, Chris, you had a comment.
Yes, thank you. Part of what Councillor Cook mentioned about education in terms of finance. Historically, and I don't know whether this is still the case, the banks used to take it in turns to go into schools to things like years 10 and 11 and give them a starting point, but I don't know whether they still do. It's a while since I've been there.
I can't say I encountered a bank during my education anyway. I was part of a finance extracurricular thing because I was in higher set maths, but I don't think we met any representatives of Barclays or Lloyds or any other banks.
We should try and encourage them to get back in, because I think students will listen to them in many ways, and certainly did in the past.
That may well be something that can come out of the strategy in action. So if there are no further comments in terms of those 3 bullet points, I'll move on to the final bullet point in the research and evidence gathering page, which is about gathering evidence for the extent of poverty and deprivation within Rother and finding out what is already being done by organisations and what organisations think could be done either by themselves, by us, or as a sort of collaborative effort. In terms of the list of organisations, this started out as several pages, I think, of organisations. As we said earlier, you can sit for hours and think of 101 different groups, people, individuals who would have something to say on this. I think this report distills it into reasonably manageable groups, but again, members may wish to further prioritise who they hear from. And as Malcolm suggested earlier, some organisations, some groups, some individuals, we may just want to send them an email or a sort of questionnaire, if you like, and get some written evidence from them and actually invite the key organisations to speak to us in more detail. So the list of organisations or people to hear from are, first of all, internally, ward councillors, specifically in terms of Sidley, Central and Rye, the sort of lower socioeconomic areas in Rother, but also ward councils in general. I think And perhaps that's something we could send out via email, is just asking councillors across the council to feedback any examples of cases where they have come across poverty in their wards, and whether there is anything they, in their view, we could be doing as a council to improve in how we deal with those issues. And then obviously hearing from officers and cabinet portfolio holders. I think this might be the one that if we were to cut the sort of, not, I don't want to say cut the fat, but if we were to sort of trim down who we listen to, this might be the one we trim, because we can gather this elsewise considering it's internal. But I think it would be good to have information from Joe, especially. I'm sure some of sort of Ben and Richard Parker Harding's areas might feed into this in one way or another. So it'd be good to hear from the heads of service. I know they're very busy, but if there's anything that they have to comment on this. And in terms of cabinet portfolio holders, people like the cabinet portfolio holder for housing and homelessness, for economic regeneration, for young children and families, all of those areas of portfolios might be useful to hear from. Oh, thank you very much, Malcolm, for the musical interlude. We'll be back after a 30-second interval there. Act 2, here we go. Right, no.
Sorry, Chair. I will now mute my microphone like it should have been before. Apologies.
That's okay. If you want to play some motivational music underneath my speaking, I'm sure it will amp up the drama. The other groups to hear from, the next bullet point is the CAB, Shelter, Hark, and Brighton Housing Trust. I think, apart from Shelter, I think CAB and Hark, we are outside bodies that we fund in some way. I don't know about Brighton Housing Trust, but I know they work very closely with CAB and Hark, and indeed Brighton Housing Trust, in my experience, certainly have a lot of knowledge in terms of relocating people into housing and the issues with the private rental sector, and Shelter obviously have a depth of knowledge. I think all of those, apart from maybe the CAB, all of those, and Hark actually, those organisations deal mainly in issues to do with housing and homelessness. And if we were to siphon that into a separate area to look at, we may want to hear from them in a different way, maybe to others, if we were sort of looking at feeding that into the housing and homelessness strategy rather than an anti-poverty strategy. I don't know. Then we've got HUG, the homelessness support group, and Warming Up the Homeless. And maybe this would be where we'd add Christians Against Poverty as well. Again, this is about sort of homelessness. Then we've got trade unions and neighbouring councils and parish councils. And I think it would be really good to hear from neighbouring councils and certainly parish councils about sort of best practice and about sort of on the ground experience from parish councils. Because I know a lot of parish councils end up dealing with the minutiae of poverty, and we don't hear all of it sometimes as a district council. Then we've got food bank, family support workers and charities, such as the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. I think there could be some valuable insight there, especially I think from the food banks in Rother, who obviously have, from what I know as well, and I imagine they've had quite an increase in usage during this COVID crisis, especially now the food parcels are no longer available to everybody. I imagine there'll be some people who will have gone from food parcels to food bank, very sadly. And then finally from the housing associations, is there any other comments on any of those? Does anyone have any other organisations they want to hear from or anything? Paul Cortell.
Simply, Chair, that Christians Against Poverty deal with debt, so perhaps they'd be better parcelled with Citizens Advice rather than with HUG, etc.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. I don't think we've got any other comments on that. So that, I believe, reaches the end of the research and evidence gathering page in the appendix. So now looking at what we're actually voting on today, which is Joe's report, which I believe is to look at starting the process in terms of the timetable, looking at the research and evidence gathering for the Joe, did you want to?
Sam, it's just to throw in at the end there, just to bring in the timeline in the context of this evidence and gathering phase, just draw your attention to it. I think it's fair to say the timeline's been largely dictated by if any changes to the council tax reduction scheme were wanted or were recommended, I should say, that we would need to hit certain timeframes. With COVID, it has compressed the evidence gathering phase as presently as October to be completed. So that gives us, once everyone's got back from, well, actually, I was about to say back from holiday, but once everyone's returned from Cornwall, it's going to be September, then October. And presently, we've got that time period to fit these consultations in and evidence gathering sessions. So either, in my view, we need, maybe not for now, but we do need to consider that. Either we might want to, before we vote on this new amended time frame, either we may want to reduce the number of organisations we might want to hear from, or expand the time frame. And there may be implications to expanding the time frame, but for the purposes of this conversation, it's just to put it on your radar, really, Sam. I didn't want you to sort of walk away with what looks like a very, admirable, ambitious evidence gathering phase, but just to draw attention, there's 8 weeks to achieve that.
Yeah, and I think that's very important to draw our attention to, and perhaps I think the next stage would be to contact the organisations and bodies that we've sort of asked to hear from in here, and to see who's available and who's willing to give us talks, and then from there we can work out, because those who aren't available to talk to us, we can get information from them via email and such, and if everybody wants to talk to us, then we may have to prioritise, but if there are only 3 or 4 are available, then they've done our job for us, so to speak, I think. But either way, I think it would be good to get evidence, either written or otherwise, from those organisations. I think that may be the key thing. And in terms of key user groups, a lot of that will be on East Sussex and Figures, I think. And it'll just be identifying where that information lacks. And that may be one of the actions, maybe to undertake a proper sort of research project to fill in the missing key user groups as a council. Does anyone have any other comments before we go into? I don't think so. Yes, Deirdre, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I missed it if we did. Did we have any mental health people involved in that list?
Let me just have a double check. Certainly, if we don't, I think it may be wise to hear from. Perhaps we wanted to.
You do mention the Sussex County Council social services. Social services is a broad range, if you like. It's probably worth specifying if that's what you wish, but I think it's implied, if not explicit.
Yeah. I think mental health is so important in this.
Absolutely.
That I feel that somebody specifically should be there on to look at that aspect of the problems that are created
Brilliant.
because of, in some cases, by mental health.
Yeah, okay. I think perhaps there's Hastings IROC, which is a charity I actually cut the ribbon on when they opened in Hastings, which do help young people in terms of young people's mental health. They might be good to contact, and maybe the commission. Sorry, what's it called? Is it the CAC, the consultant, the doctors group?
Yeah. Yes. I know you
forget
know.
the term of it. There's a few C's in an acronym.
CCC, is it? No.
CCG, that's the one.
CCG, that's it. Yeah.
Something like Consultants Commissioning Group or something like that. Too many acronyms.
I just think that should be included somewhere. Thank you.
Is there a body like Public Health England or something that might be able to give us some resources or information on that? Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure there is. Yeah.
I'm sure Joe will be able to find some organisations to contact around that.
Good on Joe.
Perhaps
we work very closely with a range of mental health providers. The mental health picture is very confusing.
Yeah,
the county delivers social care to what turns out to be by the restrictions to social care access, very high level need of mental health. Our health colleagues, so NHS colleagues, deliver the majority of mental health services to, you know, in a clinical context. So people who maybe, again, though, it's quite high need. Really, it's GPs that deal.
Yeah, I suppose so, but they haven't got
describing
the time.
Deirdre. Yeah, and well, we do have contacts with the GP surgeries. It's striking me that they might be the best place to describe really that sort of lower level anxiety, depression, which is prevalent across a lot of people in poverty. You know that.
And the harder up you are, the more you're likely to be depressed.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. Councillor Cook.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's just a practical thing. How do you envisage us gathering this? I mean, had it not been for COVID, maybe we would have had a session in the chamber where we would have invited people to come and talk to us. How do you envisage doing this? Because just reading papers doesn't always make sense. I mean, this is a fantastic system for being able to ask questions, and you've been really generous with allowing us all to pepper you with questions today, as Joe and Malcolm. So how do you envisage doing it in sort of little blocks? So let's have all the groups that want to talk to about homelessness. Let's talk to all of them for an hour and a half. And then, or perhaps in the afternoon, we could have, you know, people like, you know, the Citizens Advice Bureau and the debt counselling. Is that how you envisage doing this?
Well, I think the first stage will be to contact all the organisations and to see who actually returns our emails and calls. Once we know who is available and who is wanting to speak to us, which I imagine quite a few of them will be, I think that would possibly be the way, is to see if there are some dates where we can have possibly several speakers talking on an issue, almost like town forums do, I guess, where you have a topic of discussion and several speakers on it. And it would just be a case of, I think, fitting in as many as we can within the remits of Joe's time and our time, and how many team sessions we can have by October. Joe might have some further comments on that.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was just to say, I mean, I've been giving it some thought throughout the, you know, in between panicking about Canberra and COVID-19. I've been giving it some thought, and my view is that, as I've already described, really, is that really they're in terms of, and I think you're right, Sam, we should wait to see what comes back to us, but the evidence gathering in terms of the levels of poverty amongst user groups, as you rightly highlighted, is probably a desktop exercise that could be sort of formally fed back to you all in detail. And Malcolm's point's important here, in making sure it's understood what the data means and what the implications of the data are. In a broad sense, though, I think a session, you know, focusing on what others are doing and how we can support them better, and what's out there, where are the gaps, how can we support people better, hearing from experts, hearing about best practice elsewhere, and then more of an internal session where we hear from our own officers, and we also hear from users, our own clients and customers, and those agencies as well. So it's almost an invitation to those agencies to come in and say, how easy are we to work with? How could we improve? And that could be more of a sort of reflective and sort of evidence gathering, a sort of consultation bent to it. So it really is about those two areas, really. Yeah, it's one about support. How can we help you, and how can we support you to essentially minimise impact of poverty, but also what can we do differently? Please tell us how we can operate differently. That's a very broad, that doesn't give you any detail, but that's a sort of broad how I've been thinking about it. How we split that up, I suppose we could do multiple brief sessions, or, you know, a couple of a day or half a day each, or a day each. I don't know how we'd want to cut it up, but I think it'd be helpful to start thinking about that sooner rather than later. Just again with that time frame we're looking at, it's yeah.
And I'm happy to work with you, Joe, following this meeting to sort of help organise that in consultation with members, obviously, in terms of what times are best for everyone and what times are best for you as well, Joe. I know you've got a lot on your plate, and also take this time to say thank you for sort of doing this and sitting on here with us, because I know you are certainly overworked, would be the term, I think.
Well, ironically, this is the bit I find interesting. It's the other thing. It gets a bit tiring. There is that. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. But has that answered your questions, Councillor Cook?
Thank you. Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, Councillor Cortell.
Sorry, a tiny observation just following on from what Councillor Earl Williams said a few minutes ago about mental health. STAR crossed my mind, but of course on reflection they're mainly dealing with alcohol and drug abuse rather than specifically mental health. But I don't know whether they could be added to the list of organisations just to be sent out a questionnaire to.
They would also fall under the county council banner, as they're funded by, commissioned by the county council. So there's a range of services the county provide, which would need to learn, I think, council. Yeah,
brilliant.
Thank you.
And I'm sure when it comes to sort of sending out emails, certainly with sort of some sort of questionnaire or asking for responses, we can send out quite a wide net, I think, in terms, because I know we have quite a lot of organisations on our database and directory, so there's no harm in sending it to sort of more organisations the merrier, I think, in terms of receiving written information back. Councillor Bayliss.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just to say, just to remember that as ward members, you know, if we can supply our own evidence from our own casework, that would be really good. And I understand the issues that Councillor Cook raised about, you know, having, sometimes it's difficult to sort of go through lots and lots of reams of written evidence. But I think, you know, as a councillor for one of the areas that is high in deprivation, and I get the feeling that Councillor Stevens in Rye gets a lot of these sorts of queries, is that we do deal with a lot of casework, and summarising some of those issues and thinking about how we've managed to solve or support residents would be really useful and constructive in this process.
Absolutely, thank you very much for that. I think perhaps by the consolidation meeting, which is indicatively set for sometime in November, we can have a report which details responses from ward members in terms of their experiences, their evidence that they have from their wards, in terms of any comments from heads of service, in terms of any written evidence we've received from organisations and outside bodies, and then we can add that to what we hear in the first sessions in October to really build up a really good body of evidence as much as we can in quite a short time frame, actually, and that will hopefully help us come up with a strategy and some action points that will really make a difference. Brilliant. If there's no further comments in terms of that, would members prefer me just to go through each recommendation and vote on them 1, 2, and then 3, or do you want to vote for them as a block? Is it,
I think,
on block?
Yeah.
I think that's probably sensible. So the recommendation is it be resolved that the amendments to the timeframes for the Anti-Poverty Task and Finish Group in Appendix A be agreed, that the proposed approach to research and evidence gathering proposed in Appendix B be agreed, taking account of all the comments that we've heard today and the additional organisations to approach and things. And then number 3, the strategy and actions proposals outlined in Appendix B be noted, and then obviously we can discuss them further when it comes to actions and such. Malcolm, have you got comments?
Chairman, can I just make an observation? And would members prefer that the evidence gathering is done in private session, given the fact if you want to talk freely to organisations, it may be that rather than a public meeting is done in a private session? It just may enable organisations to perhaps give examples or do something that they may not be able to quote in public setting. I'm just suggesting it, Chairman, as just so that there's we're quite clear on the way forward of that.
Yeah.
I welcome members' views on that. I think you're right there, Malcolm, that private session might be better for the evidence gathering, and then sort of what we gain from that evidence gathering, I'm sure, will be summarised in a sort of report which can be made public later on.
Absolutely, Chairman. I mean, I know members are very that we do as much in public, and I agree with that entirely and would support that. Sometimes it's just you may lose some of nuance and some background that from the individual evidence gathering. But I entirely agree that needs to then be, I was going to say sanitized, that's the wrong word, but that needs to be brought together for the public meeting. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Cook.
Yes, no, I just wanted to absolutely agree with both of you. I do think that the evidence gathering should be done in private session, because if we as ward councillors want to talk about a particular case, it's very difficult when we're talking about he or she or them and there, and, you know, without actually sort of being able to give firm details. So I would agree with that. Thank you very much. Support that one.
Absolutely. Have we got, with that being said, unless there are any more comments, have we got anyone to propose the recommendation?
Yeah, happy to do that.
Councillor Cook, have we got a seconder? Councillor Gray, I think you're waving even though you haven't unmuted. So.
Sorry, I'm waving. And can you hear me now?
Yes.
Second it.
Fabulous. Lisa, did you want to go to a roll call vote on that?
Yes, certainly, Chairman. Councillor Coleman.
4.
Councillor Mrs Cook.
4.
Councillor Mrs Earl Williams.
4.
Councillor Gray.
4.
And Councillor Madeley.
4.
That's carried, Chairman.
Ah, fantastic. I'm really pleased that we've got through this, and hopefully we'll get some really good insight from those evidence gathering sessions, and hopefully we won't give Joe too many sleepless nights with the extra workload. So we now move on to the next agenda item, which I believe is any other business. Are there any other business items? I'm guessing not. In which case we move on to agenda item 6, date of the next meeting. Lisa, have we got any information on that?
No, Chairman, I guess that will depend on when you've had your evidence gathering sessions, and then when you want to pull together your next sort of public meeting. So I think that will probably just evolve once we sort of know where we're going with the evidence gathering. So we'll just be in touch, I think, with firming up on a firm date, unless
Okay.
Joe's got any other suggestion.
No, not particularly. I mean, I'm just looking at the timeframes again on the timeline, and there's a consolidation meeting tabled for a roughly, these are very rough timelines, obviously, for November, December sort of time. But I think it's, yeah, as Lisa says, I was really dependent on how this evidence gathering goes. We want to be concise, I think, in the evidence gathering, but we don't want to reduce it for it to become a sort of pointless exercise, do we? So yeah, perhaps once we've got that laid out more clearly, we can put a meeting in at the end of that.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so it's TBC at the moment, everybody. But with that, I officially close this, the first meeting of the Anti-Poverty Task and Finish Group. Thank you very much, and I believe Claire will tell us when we're no longer live broadcasting.